It wasn't the first time I'd worn something casual around the house, but that morning, the air felt different. The sun poured through the windows, lighting up the living room as I bent over to tie the laces on my sneakers. I was in my favorite nightgown, a soft, loose-fitting thing that barely reached my knees. I hadn't even thought about it. Richard, my husband, was out of town for work, and it was just another lazy Sunday morning at home. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me but didn't register it right away. My focus was on the stubborn knot in my laces. When I finally straightened up and turned around, there he was. Nate. He stood frozen in the doorway, a bottle of water in his hand, his eyes wide and darting anywhere but directly at me. I could see his throat bob as he swallowed hard, his cheeks flushing slightly as he quickly glanced away. For a moment, I didn't understand what was happening. Then it hit me. The way I was bent over, the way the light hit me, the way his gaze lingered just a second too long before he forced himself to look anywhere else. I didn't mean to interrupt, he stammered, taking a step back. It's fine, I said quickly, brushing my hair out of my face as if that would somehow change the mood in the room. I was just heading out for a walk. He nodded, his movements stiff. Right, I'll let you get to it. And just like that, he disappeared down the hall. But the energy he left behind lingered, crackling like static electricity in the air. I sat on the edge of the couch for a moment, trying to shake the tension out of my body. Nate was my stepson. He'd moved in just a few months ago, taking a break after graduate school while figuring out his next steps. I'd always thought of him as quiet and polite, endearingly so. But that moment in the living room had shifted something, and I couldn't deny it. Something had changed. After that morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept telling myself it wasn't a big deal, an awkward, fleeting moment, blown out of proportion by my overactive mind. But the way Nate looked at me, the way he quickly left the room, like he'd done something wrong, kept replaying in my head. I've been Catherine Boyd for almost 3 years now, though my last name still doesn't feel like it belongs to me. I was Catherine Lang for most of my life, a single mom raising my daughter Tara after my first husband left when she was only 6. Meeting Richard was supposed to be my happy ending. A respectable, successful attorney in his early 60s, he swept me off my feet with his old-fashioned charm. He made me feel like I mattered again after years of being invisible. But 3 years in, marriage to Richard isn't quite what I expected. Don't get me wrong, he's kind and steady. But he's also a workaholic who seems more married to his career than to me. He's often gone late into the evenings or traveling for cases, leaving me alone in a house that feels too big and too quiet. That's where Nate comes in. Nate is Richard's son from his first marriage. He's 25, just finished his master's in computer science, and is trying to find his footing in the world. When he moved in with us a few months ago, I barely gave it a second thought. At first, it was nice having someone else around. Nate is quiet and polite, with a sharp wit that only comes out once he's comfortable. He works as a contractor for a game development company, one I just happened to be a senior project manager at. It's a funny coincidence that occasionally overlaps in work conversations, but nothing too serious. At least, it wasn't serious until now. That awkward moment in the living room was the first time I noticed Nate as anything other than my stepson. Before that, he was just part of Richard's world, a polite young man trying to figure out his next steps. But after that morning, I started noticing him in ways I hadn't before. The way his t-shirts clung to his frame, the muscles of his arms visible even when he was doing something as mundane as making coffee. The way he pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose when he was focused on his laptop. The way he smiled, a little crooked, a little shy, but always charming. I hated myself for noticing. A week later, we found ourselves alone in the house again. Richard had taken an impromptu business trip, leaving Nate and me to fend for ourselves. That evening, I was in the kitchen making dinner when Nate walked in. He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed casually as he watched me chop vegetables. "Smells good," he said, breaking the silence. "Thanks," I replied, keeping my focus on the cutting board. "It's just spaghetti, nothing fancy." "Still better than what I'd make," he said with a laugh. I glanced at him and couldn't help but smile. "You don't cook?" "Not unless you count microwaving leftovers," he said, shrugging. I shook my head, laughing softly. That's not cooking. He grinned, and for a moment, the air between us felt lighter. But then I felt it again, that flicker of tension, like a spark catching fire. When I turned back to the counter, I could feel his eyes on me. Later that night, I was sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in hand, when Nate joined me. He sat on the other end, keeping a respectable distance, but his presence filled the room. What are you watching? He asked, nodding toward the TV. Just some old movie, I said, waving a hand dismissively. He leaned back, stretching his arms across the top of the couch. Mind if I join you? Not at all, I said, though my voice came out quieter than I intended. We sat there in silence for a while, the only sound coming from the TV. I was hyper-aware of how close he was, the faint scent of his cologne reaching me. At one point, I glanced over at him and found him already looking at me. He didn't look away this time. Catherine, he said softly, his tone unreadable. Yes? I asked, my heart beating faster. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. But before he could say anything, he seemed to think better of it and turned back to the TV. Nothing, he said after a pause. But it wasn't nothing. I knew that. The more time we spent together, the harder it became to ignore the growing tension between us. It was in the way his hand brushed against mine when he handed me a plate. The way our conversations lingered a little too long. The way his gaze sometimes dropped to my lips when I spoke. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't just him. It was me too. That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I thought about Richard, how distant he'd been lately, how he barely seemed to notice me anymore. And then I thought about Nate, how he looked at me like I was someone worth noticing. It wasn't fair to anyone involved, least of all me. But fair didn't matter. What mattered was the spark I hadn't felt in years. The pull I couldn't seem to resist. Something was bound to happen. It was only a matter of time. The moment it happened, I knew there was no going back. It started like so many other nights since Nate moved in. Quiet, unassuming. Richard was out of town again, leaving the house to the two of us. I was in the kitchen finishing a glass of wine, savoring the stillness of the evening, when Nate walked in. Late night? He asked, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. I shrugged, swirling the wine in my glass. Just unwinding. He leaned against the counter, the faint glow of the kitchen light casting shadows across his face. You work too hard, you know that? I laughed softly. You sound like Richard. Richard doesn't notice half the things you do, he said, his tone more serious than I expected. The comment caught me off guard, and I looked up at him. His gaze was steady, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I notice, he added quietly. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I set my glass down and turned toward the hallway. Good night, Nate, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But before I could take a step, I felt his hand on my arm. It wasn't aggressive or forceful. His touch was light, tentative, as though he was giving me the chance to pull away, but I didn't. Catherine, he said softly, his voice trembling slightly. Can we talk? I turned to face him, my heart pounding. What is there to talk about? His eyes searched mine, and for a moment, he hesitated. Then, as if something inside him snapped, he closed the distance between us. His lips brushed against mine, soft and tentative at first, as if he was waiting for me to stop him. I should have. Every logical part of me screamed to push him away, to end this before it went any further. But the way he kissed me, the way his hands gently cupped my face, the way his breath hitched when I leaned into him, made every rational thought disappear. I kissed him back. The kiss deepened, growing more urgent with every passing second. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer as my fingers tangled in his hair. The counter pressed against my back, grounding me in the reality of what we were doing. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathless. We can't, I whispered, though the words felt hollow. I know, he said, his forehead resting against mine. But I don't want to stop. Neither did I. That night, we didn't sleep. It wasn't just about the physical connection, though that was undeniable. It was the way he looked at me, the way he touched me, like I was something precious, something he couldn't believe he was allowed to have. Afterward, we lay tangled together on the couch, the faint glow of the TV casting shadows across the room. Nate's fingers traced lazy patterns on my arm, and for the first time in years I felt truly seen. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly, breaking the silence. I didn't answer right away. Did I? I knew I should. I knew this was wrong on so many levels. But as I looked at him, his face soft and open in the dim light, I couldn't bring myself to lie. "No," I said finally. His lips curved into a small, almost shy smile, and he pulled me closer. In the days that followed, I told myself it would never happen again. I avoided him as much as I could, throwing myself into work and pretending the night we shared was just a fleeting mistake. But the memory of his touch, the way he made me feel, lingered in the back of my mind, refusing to fade. And then it happened again. It was late on a Friday night, and I was sitting in my office at home, buried in project deadlines. Richard was out of town, again, and the house was quiet except for the faint hum of my laptop. I didn't hear Nate come in until he was standing in the doorway. "Still working?" he asked, his voice soft. I looked up, startled. "I didn't hear you come in." He stepped into the room, leaning against the desk. "You shouldn't work so late. You'll burn out." I sighed, closing my laptop. Deadlines don't wait. He studied me for a moment, his gaze lingering in a way that made my pulse quicken. "You're always taking care of everyone else," he said quietly. "When do you let someone take care of you?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I opened my mouth to respond, but he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face before I could speak. "Catherine?" he said, his voice trembling slightly. My heart raced as he leaned closer, his lips inches from mine. I knew I should stop him, knew I should put an end to whatever this was becoming. But when his mouth met mine, I couldn't. After that night, there was no denying it anymore. We started finding excuses to be alone together. Quiet moments in the house when Richard wasn't around, late-night conversations that always ended the same way. The secrecy only made it more intoxicating. Every touch, every stolen kiss, felt like a defiance of the rules we were breaking. But with each encounter, the weight of what we were doing grew heavier. "This is dangerous," I said one night as we lay in bed, the room lit only by the faint glow of the moon. "I don't care," Nate said, his voice firm. "Do you?" I hesitated, my heart aching with the truth. "No," I admitted, but I did care. I cared about what would happen if we got caught, about the life I was risking for something that couldn't possibly last. And yet, I couldn't stop. After that second night, there was no pretending it wouldn't happen again. We fell into a rhythm, one that was both thrilling and terrifying. It started small. His hand brushing against mine as we passed each other in the hallway, whispered conversations late at night when the house was still. But it didn't take long for those moments to spiral into something much bigger. One Friday evening, Richard called to let me know he'd be staying late at the office. By now, it was almost expected, another late-night case, another excuse. I barely listened to his explanation as I stirred the pot of pasta on the stove, my mind elsewhere. When Nate walked into the kitchen, the tension hit immediately. He stood there for a moment, watching me with that quiet intensity that had become impossible to ignore. "Dinner's almost ready," I said, trying to sound casual. "Smells good," he said, stepping closer. I turned to face him, and suddenly the space between us felt much smaller. He was close enough that I could see the faint stubble on his jawline, the way his shirt clung to his chest. Neither of us spoke, but the air was thick with unspoken words. Finally, he broke the silence. "Catherine," he said, his voice low. "Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, with Richard, with all of this." He gestured vaguely toward the house. "Are you happy?" I hesitated, the truth pressing against my lips. "It's complicated," I said finally. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. "It shouldn't be." The moment stretched between us, and before I could think better of it, I leaned into him. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me close, and suddenly nothing else mattered. After that, there was no holding back. We started meeting in secret, quick, stolen moments around the house while Richard was at work, and long, passionate nights when the opportunity arose. Each time felt more reckless than the last, but the thrill of it was intoxicating. One afternoon, while Richard was at the office, Nate and I found ourselves alone in the living room. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, when he came in and sat beside me. "Don't you ever get tired of pretending?" he asked suddenly. I looked at him, startled. "What do you mean?" "This," he said, gesturing between us, "sneaking around, hiding what we feel." I sighed, setting my phone aside. "We don't have a choice, Nate. You know that." He leaned closer, his voice soft but firm. "What if we did?" His words lingered in the air, tempting and dangerous. But I couldn't let myself think about that, not yet. Work became another layer of complication. Nate's contract with Apex Interactive meant that we saw each other outside of the house too. At first we were careful, keeping our distance during meetings, avoiding lingering in the same spaces. But it wasn't long before the lines blurred. One afternoon I was working late in my office when Nate knocked on the door. "Come in," I said without looking up, assuming it was my assistant Kara. When I saw him standing there, my heart skipped a beat. "What are you doing here?" I asked, glancing at the clock. "Needed to talk to you about the new campaign," he said, closing the door behind him. I frowned, confused. "That's not my department. You should—" "Catherine," he said, cutting me off. "You know why I'm here." His gaze held mine, and suddenly, the small office felt suffocating. Before I could protest, he crossed the room and kissed me. It was impulsive, reckless, and completely inappropriate, but as his hands tangled in my hair and my back pressed against the desk, I couldn't bring myself to care. Our affair was like a fire, intense, consuming, and impossible to control. We started meeting in places that felt riskier with each passing day. A hotel downtown became our go-to spot, a safe haven where we could let our guard down. "I wish we didn't have to hide," Nate said one night as we lay tangled together in the dimly lit room. I traced a finger along his chest, my heart aching with the weight of his words. "You know we don't have a choice." "Maybe you don't," he said quietly. His words stung, but I didn't respond. Deep down, I knew he was right. It wasn't just the secrecy that made things complicated. The more time we spent together, the more I realized how deeply I was falling for him. It wasn't just about the way he made me feel physically, though that was undeniable. It was the way he listened. The way he made me laugh, the way he saw me in a way Richard never did. But with every high came the looming threat of exposure. Richard started noticing my distant behavior. One evening, as we sat across from each other at dinner, he gave me a long, searching look. "Is everything okay?" he asked finally. "Of course," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "You've been distracted lately," he said. "Is it work?" "Yes," I lied. "Just a lot on my plate right now." He nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. At work, Kara became another source of tension. As my assistant, she was privy to more of my life than most, and I started to notice her watching me more closely. One afternoon, as I was leaving a meeting, she pulled me aside. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Why wouldn't it be?" I replied, feigning ignorance. She hesitated, her gaze lingering. "No reason. You've just seemed different lately." I forced a laugh, brushing her off. "Just work stress, nothing to worry about." But the way she looked at me made it clear she wasn't convinced. Despite the growing tension, I couldn't stop. Nate had become my escape, my sanctuary in a life that felt increasingly suffocating. But as much as I wanted to believe we could keep this up forever, a part of me knew the truth. The walls were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. I always knew it would fall apart. Affairs like ours are fragile things, built on secrets and lies. The thrill can only last so long before reality catches up. It started with Kara. One afternoon, I returned from a meeting to find her standing by my desk, holding my phone. My heart sank as I saw the lock screen still lit up, a message from Nate flashing across it. "Kara," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "what are you doing?" She looked up at me, her face carefully blank. "Your phone was buzzing. I thought it might be important." I crossed the room, snatching the phone from her hand. "Thank you," I said, my tone clipped. But as I turned away, I saw the faint smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "It's none of my business, of course," she said lightly. "But maybe you should be more careful about where you leave your phone." The implication hung in the air, sharp and heavy. I tried to brush it off, but Kara's demeanor toward me shifted after that. She was polite, professional even, but there was a new edge to her tone, an unspoken challenge in the way she looked at me. It wasn't long before I started noticing the whispers, the subtle glances exchanged between colleagues as I walked through the office. And then, there was Richard. That evening, as I sat in the living room scrolling through emails, Richard came in and sat across from me. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Finally, he spoke. "Catherine, is there something you want to tell me?" My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "You've been distant lately," he said, choosing his words carefully. "And I've noticed how much time you've been spending with Nate." The mention of Nate sent a jolt of panic through me. "He's your son, Richard," I said quickly. "Of course, I'm going to spend time with him." He nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't leave mine. "Just make sure you're not crossing any lines." It was a warning, plain and simple. The breaking point came a week later. I was in my office going over the final revisions for a campaign when I got the email. Subject: HR inquiry, immediate attention required. The message was short and direct. I was to meet with Human Resources at 2 p.m. that afternoon to discuss a serious matter. My blood ran cold. When I arrived at the HR office, I was greeted by Victoria, the head of HR, and another manager I didn't recognize. Their expressions were neutral, but the tension in the room was suffocating. "Catherine, thank you for coming," Victoria said, gesturing for me to sit. As soon as I did, she slid a folder across the table toward me. "These were brought to our attention anonymously," she said. I opened the folder, my hands trembling. Inside were printed copies of emails and texts between Nate and me, messages that left little room for interpretation. "This is a serious breach of company policy," Victoria continued. "We're conducting a full investigation, but we need you to confirm whether these messages are authentic." I stared at the pages, my heart pounding. Denying it would be pointless, the evidence was damning. "Yes," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "They're real." Victoria nodded, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for your honesty. We'll be in touch once the investigation is complete." The meeting ended, and I walked out of the office, feeling like the ground had been ripped out from under me. That night, Richard confronted me. I was sitting at the kitchen table nursing a glass of wine when he came in. His face was flushed with anger, his voice tight as he spoke. "I know," he said, slamming his hand down on the table. "I know about you and Nate." I froze, the glass halfway to my lips. "Richard, Don't," he snapped. "Don't you dare try to deny it." His words cut through me like a knife, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "How long?" he demanded. "How long has this been going on?" I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his eyes. "A few months," I admitted quietly. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Unbelievable. I trusted you, Catherine. I trusted you with my son. I didn't mean for this to happen," I said, my voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Well, you did," he said coldly. "And now, you can pack your things and get out." By the time Nate came home, Richard had left for the night, slamming the door behind him. Nate found me sitting on the couch, my face buried in my hands. "What happened?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "Richard knows," I said, looking up at him. His face paled. "What did he say?" "He wants me to leave," I said, my voice hollow. Nate sat down beside me, his hand resting on my knee. "Then we'll go together," he said firmly. I shook my head, tears spilling down my cheeks. "No, Nate, this has gone too far." He frowned, his grip tightening. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we can't keep doing this," I said, my voice trembling. "It's over." His eyes widened, and for a moment he looked like I'd slapped him. "You don't mean that." "I do," I said, though the words felt like poison. He stood abruptly, his jaw clenched. "You're just scared," he said. "You care more about what people think than about us." "That's not true," I said, my voice breaking. "Isn't it?" He shot back, his eyes blazing. Before I could respond, he turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. That night, as I lay alone in the bed I'd once shared with Richard, I realized how much I'd lost. My marriage, my career, my home, all of it had crumbled because of choices I couldn't take back. And yet, as I stared at the ceiling, I couldn't decide which hurt more, the consequences of what I'd done, or the thought of never seeing Nate again. It's been 6 months since everything fell apart. I'm sitting in a small, sunlit apartment on the other side of town, far from the house that once felt more like Richard's than mine. The life I built there, the one that looked so polished from the outside, feels like a distant memory. I resigned from Apex Interactive after the HR investigation concluded. They didn't fire me, but the writing was on the wall. A quiet resignation was the only way to preserve what little dignity I had left. Richard filed for divorce the day after he confronted me. The process was swift and cold. Just signatures on papers, no long arguments or drawn-out negotiations. He couldn't even look at me during the mediation. And Nate? He moved out the same week I did. I don't know where he went, and I haven't heard from him since. The days are quieter now. Too quiet. I've picked up freelance work to pay the bills, but it doesn't fill the void. My evenings are spent staring at the city skyline from my tiny balcony, a glass of wine in hand, wondering where it all went wrong, and where I might go from here. At first, I blamed Nate for everything. For crossing the line, for tempting me, for making me feel things I hadn't felt in years. But as the weeks turned into months, I realized the truth. This wasn't just about him. I was lonely. Richard had been gone long before Nate came into the picture, disappearing behind late nights at the office and a wall of indifference. I craved attention, affection, the kind of spark that reminded me I was still alive. And Nate gave me that. I don't regret the way he made me feel. But I regret the price we both paid. One rainy evening, as I sat on the couch flipping through an old photo album, my phone buzzed. The name on the screen stopped me cold. Nate. My heart pounded as I stared at the message. It was short, just a few words, but they hit me like a freight train. I miss you. Can we talk? I wanted to ignore it. I told myself I should, but the truth was, I missed him too. I spent the next hour staring at the phone, typing and deleting responses. Finally, I settled on the only thing I could say. Come over. When I opened the door, he was standing there, soaked from the rain but looking exactly as I remembered. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I didn't think you'd answer, he said finally. Neither did I admitted. He stepped inside, dripping water onto the floor, but I didn't care. I just stood there, my emotions swirling, relief, guilt, hope, and something I wasn't ready to name. I've thought about you every day, he said, his voice low. I know we messed up, but I don't care. Stop, I said, cutting him off. Don't say it, not yet. He looked at me, confused, but he didn't argue. We sat on the couch, the sound of rain filling the silence between us. I don't know if we can fix this, I said finally, my voice trembling. But I know I can't keep pretending you don't matter to me. You do matter to me, he said, his voice firm. You always have. The sincerity in his words broke something inside me, and before I could think better of it, I reached for him. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me close, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. I don't know what comes next for us. Maybe this is just another mistake, another choice I'll regret. Or maybe, just maybe, it's a chance to rebuild something from the wreckage we left behind. All I know is that I'm not ready to let go. Not yet. I didn't mean to spill the water, but there it was, a cool rush against my skin, soaking through the thin fabric of my dress and leaving it clinging uncomfortably to me. I gasped, startled by the cold, and clumsily reached for a napkin, only to knock the empty glass off the edge of the table. Careful, Nathan said, his voice calm but tinged with amusement. I looked up, flustered, and found him watching me. The way his eyes flickered, just briefly, to where the damp fabric clung to my chest before snapping back to my face, made my breath hitch. It was such a small thing, so fleeting, but it left the air between us charged in a way I didn't know how to name. Here, he said, grabbing a dish towel from the counter. He handed it to me, his fingers brushing mine as I took it. Are you okay? I'm fine, I said quickly, though my cheeks burned as I pressed the towel against my dress. It was a casual lunch, just the two of us. Nothing out of the ordinary. He'd moved back home after college to save money while figuring out his next steps, and I'd welcomed the company. The house had been too quiet for too long, and having someone else here, a warm presence in the kitchen, the faint sound of footsteps upstairs, made it feel less like a mausoleum. But moments like this, they weren't supposed to happen. Nathan leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, his lips curving into a small, knowing smile. You really are clumsy sometimes. I rolled my eyes, trying to brush off the moment as if it didn't matter. I've always been like this, I said lightly, though my voice wavered. You know that. Yeah, he said, his tone softer now. I do. There was something in the way he said it, something that made my heart beat just a little faster. I looked away, focusing on dabbing at the damp spot on my dress, and tried to ignore the heat creeping up my neck. The truth was, I hadn't felt this self-conscious in years, not since before his father passed. Back then, I'd been too busy balancing the demands of a blended family and a husband who expected everything to be just so. But now, with no one to answer to, I'd fallen into a quiet routine, simple meals, quiet nights, and the occasional glass of wine to keep me company. Nathan's return had disrupted that routine in ways I hadn't anticipated. He was taller now, broader, with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. And while I still thought of him as the boy I'd helped raise, moments like these made it hard to ignore the man he'd become. "Do you want me to get you another dress?" he asked, nodding toward the damp spot that was still painfully obvious. "No," I said quickly. "This will dry in no time." "Suit yourself," he said with a shrug, though his eyes lingered on me for a moment longer, before he turned to pour himself another glass of water. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, my heart still racing. It was nothing, I told myself. Just a moment of awkwardness. But the way my chest tightened, the way my skin prickled under his gaze, it felt like the beginning of something I wasn't ready to name. The afternoon sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, casting golden patterns on the kitchen floor. I had thought the moment from lunch was behind us, a silly accident I could laugh off later. But as I stood at the sink rinsing the plates, my mind kept replaying the way Nathan's eyes had lingered. I tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the rhythmic sound of water running and the familiar comfort of domestic tasks. The house, usually so quiet, felt heavier now, charged with something unspoken I couldn't quite name. "Need a hand?" His voice startled me, and I turned to see Nathan leaning against the doorway, his arms crossed casually. He had changed into a plain white t-shirt and jeans, his hair slightly tousled from running a hand through it. "I'm fine," I said a little too quickly. "It's just a few dishes." He stepped into the room anyway, rolling up his sleeves as he approached the sink. "I'm here, might as well help," he said with a small shrug. Before I could protest, he reached for a dish towel and began drying the plates I handed him. We worked side by side in comfortable silence for a while, the sound of the water and the soft clink of dishes the only thing breaking the quiet. It felt normal, familiar, like so many moments we'd shared in this kitchen over the years, and yet I couldn't shake the awareness of his presence. The way his arm brushed against mine as he reached for another plate, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. "You're quieter than usual," he said suddenly, his voice breaking through my thoughts. I glanced at him, startled. "Am I?" He nodded, his gaze flicking to me briefly before returning to the plate in his hands. "You've been distracted all day." "I've just got a lot on my mind," I said, turning back to the sink. "Like what?" The question was simple, casual, but it caught me off guard. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Just the usual," I said vaguely, hoping he wouldn't press. But Nathan wasn't one to let things go. "The usual, huh?" he said, a faint teasing note in his voice. "You're always taking care of everything. Maybe you need someone to take care of you for a change." I froze, the plate in my hand slipping slightly under the water. "Nathan, that's not." "I'm serious," he said, his tone softening. "You do so much for everyone else. When's the last time you let someone help you?" I didn't have an answer for that. He reached over and gently took the plate from my hands, his fingers brushing mine. The touch was brief, but it sent a shiver up my spine. "Let me finish this," he said quietly. For a moment, I wanted to argue, to insist I didn't need help. But the look in his eyes, steady, sincere, made my protest falter. I stepped back, drying my hands on a towel as he turned back to the sink. I watched him work, his movements unhurried, his focus on the task in front of him. It was such a small thing, but the sight of him standing there, sleeves rolled up, water dripping from his hands, it was impossible to ignore how much he'd changed. "How's the job hunt going?" I asked, trying to steer the conversation to safer ground. He glanced over his shoulder, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Slow," he admitted. "Seems like every listing wants 5 years of experience for an entry-level position." "You'll find something," I said, my voice firm. "You're smart, capable. It's just a matter of time." Thanks, he said, turning back to the sink. It means a lot, coming from you. There was something in the way he said it, soft, almost hesitant, that made my chest tighten. I turned away, busying myself with wiping down the counter. I mean it, he said, his voice quieter now. You've always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. I paused, my hand stilling on the cloth. Of course I believe in you, I said softly. I've seen what you're capable of. When I looked at him, he was watching me, his gaze steady and unflinching. The intensity of it made my breath catch, and for a moment, I felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of us. You've always been there for me, he said, his voice low, even when you didn't have to be. It's what family does, I said, though my voice trembled slightly. Maybe, he said, his lips curving into a faint, almost bittersweet smile. But not everyone does it the way you do. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, and I felt my pulse quicken. I looked away, focusing on the countertop as I tried to steady myself. When the last dish was dried and put away, Nathan leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. Thanks for letting me help, he said, his tone light but his gaze lingering on me. You didn't exactly give me a choice, I said, forcing a small smile. He grinned, the tension between us easing slightly. Fair enough. As he turned to leave the kitchen, I let out a shaky breath, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. But before he stepped through the doorway, he paused, glancing back at me. You should let yourself relax more, he said softly. You deserve it. And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the quiet kitchen, his words echoing in my mind. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling the rapid beat of my heart, and wondered why something so simple, so small, had left me feeling like the ground beneath me had shifted. The afternoon sun was gentle, casting soft, golden light over the backyard. A light breeze stirred the leaves of the old oak tree, sending shifting patterns of shadow across the patio, where I sat with a cold glass of lemonade. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, and the faint sweetness of the honeysuckle that climbed along the garden fence. Nathan had suggested taking a break after we finished cleaning up the kitchen. Let's sit outside for a bit, he'd said, already grabbing a chair and carrying it out to the patio. I'd agreed, mostly because I couldn't think of a reason not to. Though part of me wondered if being alone with him out here was a good idea. He lounged in the chair beside me, his long legs stretched out and crossed at the ankles. He held a glass of iced tea in one hand, the condensation trickling down the sides, while the other rested casually on the armrest. His t-shirt clung to his chest in the summer heat, and the sunlight made the hints of red in his dark hair gleam. This is nice, he said after a moment, tilting his head back to look at the sky. It is, I agreed, though my focus was less on the scenery and more on the quiet tension I couldn't seem to shake. It wasn't uncomfortable, exactly, but there was an awareness in the air between us, a weight to every glance, every pause. I told myself I was imagining it, but the flutter in my chest told me otherwise. You used to come out here all the time, Nathan said, breaking the silence. I remember you and Dad sitting on this patio, drinking wine and talking late into the night. The mention of his father sent a pang through me, bittersweet and familiar. We did, I said softly. He loved this spot. Nathan nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I never understood how he could just sit and stare at the trees for hours, but now I get it. I glanced at him, surprised. You've changed, I said without thinking. He looked at me, one brow lifting in amusement. How so? You used to be restless, I said, swirling the ice in my glass. Always moving, always doing something. Sitting still wasn't really your thing. Nathan chuckled, the sound low and warm. I guess I've had time to think. College will do that to you, especially when you don't have everything figured out. His tone had shifted, growing quieter, more thoughtful. I turned to him, studying his profile, the set of his jaw, the way his brows furrowed slightly as he stared into the distance. You don't have to have everything figured out, I said gently. Life doesn't work that way. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know, but it feels like I'm supposed to. Like everyone expects me to have some grand plan, and I don't. Whose expectations are you trying to meet? I asked, tilting my head. Nathan hesitated, then glanced at me, his gaze steady. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe, mine. Or maybe I'm just scared of disappointing people. My heart ached at his honesty. and I reached over without thinking, placing my hand over his. "You could never disappoint me," I said softly. His eyes flickered to where our hands touched, and I realized too late what I'd done. I started to pull away, but his fingers closed over mine, holding me there. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and warm. For a moment we stayed like that, the world around us quiet and still. I could feel the heat of his skin, the strength in his grip, and my heart raced in a way I hadn't felt in years. I pulled my hand back, the loss of his touch leaving a strange hollowness in its wake. "You don't have to figure everything out today," I said, my voice a little unsteady. Nathan smiled faintly, but his eyes lingered on me. "Neither do you," he said softly. His words hit me harder than I expected, and I looked away, focusing on the garden. The truth of it settled heavily in my chest. I'd spent so long trying to keep everything together, trying to be the rock, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to let someone else carry even a little of the weight. We fell into a companionable silence, the kind that felt both soothing and charged. The afternoon stretched on, the golden light shifting as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Eventually, Nathan stood, stretching his arms over his head. "I should get started on dinner," he said, his tone light. "You're cooking?" I asked, raising a brow. "Don't sound so surprised," he teased. "I've picked up a few skills since I burned that frozen pizza in high school." I laughed, the sound easing some of the tension in my chest. "Well, I'm looking forward to it," I said, standing and gathering my glass. As we walked back into the house, I couldn't help but steal a glance at him, my heart still racing from the moment we'd shared. Whatever this was, whatever was building between us, it was becoming harder to ignore. And part of me didn't want to. The soft strains of the piano filled the house, wrapping around me like a familiar, haunting melody. I stood at the edge of the living room, the dim glow of the table lamp casting a warm light over Nathan as he played. His back was to me, his shoulders relaxed, his hands gliding effortlessly over the keys. I didn't know he still played. The sight of him there, lost in the music, caught me off guard. It wasn't something he'd done often, at least not since high school, and the unexpectedness of it stirred something deep inside me, a strange mix of nostalgia and tenderness. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should interrupt. But as the melody shifted, softening into something slower, more wistful, I found myself stepping into the room. "You've been hiding this talent," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. Nathan's hand stilled and he turned slightly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I didn't know you were listening." "It's hard not to," I said, moving closer. "You're really good." He chuckled, turning back to the piano. "I wouldn't go that far. It's just something I mess around with when I need to clear my head." "Well, it's beautiful," I said, settling into the armchair near the piano. Nathan glanced at me, his smile fading into something more thoughtful. "This was Dad's favorite song," he said quietly. I felt my chest tighten at the mention of his father. "He used to hum it all the time," I said, my voice soft. Nathan nodded, his fingers brushing over the keys. "I started learning it for him when I was a kid. Never told him, though. I wanted it to be a surprise." The weight of his words hung in the air, and I felt a familiar ache settle in my chest. "He would have loved that," I said, my voice trembling slightly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, but not uncomfortable, as though the music had opened a door to something we both carried but rarely acknowledged. Nathan's hands returned to the keys, his movements slower now, more deliberate. The melody began again, soft and steady, and I closed my eyes, letting it wash over me. "Do you want to try?" he asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the music. My eyes opened, and I blinked at him, startled. "Me?" He nodded, scooting over slightly on the bench. "Come on, it's easy." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "I don't think so. I'm terrible at anything that requires coordination." Nathan grinned, patting the empty space beside him. "I'll help you. Come on." I hesitated, but something in his expression, a quiet, playful determination, made it impossible to say no. With a sigh, I stood and moved to sit beside him, the small bench forcing us closer than I expected. "Okay," he said, his tone light. "Just follow my lead." He placed my hands on the keys, his fingers brushing against mine as he guided them. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver up my spine, and I swallowed hard, trying to focus on the music instead of the way his leg pressed against mine. "See?" he said, his voice low and close to my ear. Not so hard. I laughed softly, my fingers fumbling over the keys. I'm pretty sure I just butchered that. You're doing fine, he said, his tone warm. For the next few minutes he guided me through the melody, his hands occasionally covering mine to correct my movements. The closeness between us was undeniable, each touch, each brush of his arm against mine, adding to the quiet tension that had been building for weeks. At one point, he reached over to press a key I'd missed, his hand lingering on mine for just a moment too long. I froze, my breath catching, and when I looked at him, his gaze was already on me. The room felt impossibly still, the air between us charged with something I couldn't name. Nathan, I began, my voice barely above a whisper. His hand slid away and he straightened, clearing his throat. Sorry, he said, his tone quieter now. I got carried away. It's fine, I said quickly, though my heart was still racing. He stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair. I think that's enough music for one night, he said with a faint smile. Yeah, I murmured, standing as well. For a moment we stood there, the unspoken tension between us almost unbearable. I wanted to say something to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. I'll clean up here, he said finally, his tone casual. You should get some rest. I nodded, my hands trembling slightly as I turned to leave the room. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, the soft strains of the piano began again, quieter this time. Almost hesitant. I paused, my hand resting on the banister, and let the music wash over me one last time before retreating into the safety of the dark. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that only comes late at night when the world outside has gone dark, and the only sound is the faint creak of old floorboards beneath careful steps. I hadn't been able to sleep, not after everything that had happened earlier. My mind felt like a tangled mess of thoughts and emotions, each one more confusing than the last. The dim light of the kitchen drew me in like a beacon, and I stepped inside, the cool tile beneath my feet grounding me. I poured myself a glass of water, letting the silence settle around me, but then, as I turned, I nearly dropped the glass. Nathan was standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the soft glow of the hallway light. Couldn't sleep either? He asked, his voice low, husky from the late hour. I shook my head, trying to steady my racing heart. No, you? Same, he said, stepping into the room. He was barefoot, wearing just a t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly mussed as if he'd been lying awake, tossing and turning. He moved to the counter, leaning against it as he watched me. You've been quiet today, he said softly. I let out a small, humorless laugh, setting the glass down on the counter. You've said that before. That's because it's true, he said, his tone light but probing. What's going on? I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Nathan tilted his head, his gaze steady and unrelenting. That's not like you, he said. You always know, or at least, you pretend to. His words struck a nerve, and I felt a flush of irritation rise in my chest. Maybe I'm tired of pretending, I snapped, the words escaping before I could stop them. Nathan straightened, his brow furrowing. Tired of pretending what? I hesitated, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the counter. The weight of everything I'd been holding back felt unbearable, and for a moment I wanted to tell him. I wanted to let it all out, to stop hiding, but instead, I shook my head, turning away. It doesn't matter, I said quietly. It does to me, he said, his voice firm but gentle. The intensity in his tone made me pause, and I turned back to him, my heart pounding. Nathan, He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, and suddenly the space between us felt impossibly small. Talk to me, he said softly, please. I swallowed hard, my chest tight as I met his gaze. There was something in his eyes, something raw and vulnerable, that made it impossible to look away. I've been lost, I admitted finally, the words trembling as they left my lips. Ever since your father passed, I've been trying to hold everything together, but I don't know who I am anymore. Nathan's expression softened, and he took another step closer, his hand brushing lightly against mine on the counter. You don't have to hold it all together, he said quietly. Not by yourself. His touch sent a shiver through me, and I felt my breath hitch. It's not that simple, I said, my voice breaking. Maybe it is, he said, his thumb tracing a slow circle against the back of my hand. Maybe you've just convinced yourself it's not. I stared at him, my heart racing as his words sank in. There was no judgment in his tone, no pressure, just quiet reassurance, a steady presence that made me feel like I could finally let my guard down. "You don't understand," I whispered. "Then help me understand," he said, his voice soft but insistent. The silence between us stretched, heavy and charged, as I struggled to find the words. But before I could speak, Nathan's hand moved, his fingers brushing my cheek. The touch was light, hesitant, as if he were waiting for me to pull away. I didn't. "Nathan," I said softly, my voice trembling. He leaned in slightly, his forehead nearly touching mine. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his breath warm against my skin. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it, and every nerve in my body felt alive, electrified. But I didn't tell him to stop. Instead, I let out a shaky breath, my eyes fluttering shut as his lips brushed against mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if he were giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. My hands found his shoulders, gripping tightly as the kiss deepened, the weight of everything we'd been holding back spilling over in a rush of emotion. When we finally pulled apart, our breaths coming fast and uneven, Nathan rested his forehead against mine, his hands still cradling my face. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice raw. "For what?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "For complicating things," he said. "For making this harder for you." I shook my head, tears stinging at the corners of my eyes. "It's not just you," I said softly. "I'm just as responsible." Nathan's thumb brushed against my cheek, wiping away a tear I hadn't realized had fallen. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said. I needed you to know how I feel." His words left me breathless, and I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The quiet between us was thick with unspoken words. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. The next evening, the tension between us was almost unbearable. The house felt too small, every shared glance too loaded, every moment alone too charged. I'd spent the day trying to keep busy, cleaning, organizing, anything to avoid the weight of Nathan's confession and the kiss we'd shared the night before. But now, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the golden light of dusk spilled through the windows, I found myself in the living room, absently folding a blanket. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the ceiling fan, and I could feel his presence before I saw him. "Nathan," I said softly, not turning around. "Hey," he replied, his voice low, careful. I turned to face him, my hands twisting in the fabric of the blanket. He was standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame, his expression unreadable. He looked younger like this, in his plain t-shirt and jeans, but there was something in his eyes that felt heavier, older. "We need to talk," I said, my voice trembling slightly. He stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. "Yeah," he said, his tone quiet. "We do." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched out, thick and heavy, and I struggled to find the right words. "About last night," I began, my voice faltering. "That shouldn't have happened." Nathan's jaw tightened, and he nodded slowly. "I know," he said, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes. "Hurt, maybe?" That made my chest ache. "It's not that I don't." I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. "It's just complicated." "Of course it's complicated," he said, his voice sharper now. "But that doesn't mean it wasn't real." His words hit me like a blow, and I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Nathan, we can't." "Why not?" he interrupted, stepping closer. "Why can't we?" "Because it's wrong," I said, my voice breaking. "Because people would never understand. Because I'm supposed to be the one who sets boundaries." "And what about what we feel?" he asked, his tone quieter now but no less intense. "Does that not matter?" "It matters," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Of course it matters, but it doesn't make it right." Nathan closed the distance between us, his hands clenched at his sides. "I don't care what anyone else thinks," he said fiercely. "I care about you, and I think you care about me too." I looked up at him, my breath catching at the raw vulnerability in his expression. "Nathan, just tell me the truth," he said, his voice trembling. "Do you feel the same way, or am I imagining this?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth was too heavy, too dangerous, and I was terrified of what might happen if I said it out loud. But the silence between us was answer enough. Nathan stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. "You don't have to be scared. he said softly. I'm not going anywhere. The warmth of his touch, the steadiness of his presence, it was too much. I felt my defenses crumbling, the walls I'd built around myself breaking under the weight of everything I'd been holding back. Before I could stop myself, I reached for him, my fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. I don't know how to do this, I whispered, my voice trembling. You don't have to, he said, his hands coming up to cradle my face. We'll figure it out together. And then he kissed me. This time, there was no hesitation, no holding back. The kiss was deep, intense, filled with all the things we couldn't say. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt my body melt into his. I shouldn't have let it happen, but in that moment, it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the feel of his lips on mine. The warmth of his touch, the way he held me like I was the only thing that mattered in the world. Nathan, I murmured against his lips, my voice breaking. I'm here, he whispered, his forehead resting against mine. I'm not going anywhere. His hand slid down my arms, his touch slow and deliberate, and I shivered under the intensity of his gaze. He guided me gently backward until my legs hit the edge of the couch, and we sank down together, his weight pressing into me in a way that felt both overwhelming and impossibly right. Time seemed to blur, each moment melting into the next as the world outside faded away. His touch was warm, steady, grounding me even as I felt like I was falling. When it was over, the room was quiet again, the stillness broken only by the sound of our breathing. Nathan lay beside me, his arm draped over my waist, his face buried in the crook of my neck. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice raw. For what? I asked softly, my fingers brushing through his hair. For making things harder for you, he said. I shook my head, tears stinging at the corners of my eyes. You didn't, I said. I think I've been making things harder for myself. Nathan lifted his head, his gaze searching mine. What happens now? He asked. I don't know, I admitted, my voice trembling, but we'll figure it out. The faintest hint of a smile tugged at his lips, and he pulled me closer, his arms tightening around me. For the first time in years, I felt a strange, fragile sense of hope, a feeling I thought I'd lost forever. The morning light crept into the living room, painting the walls in soft shades of gold and amber. I woke to the weight of his arm draped across my waist, his breath warm and steady against the back of my neck. For a moment, I let myself stay there, eyes closed, heart full and heavy all at once. But then reality returned, sharp and unrelenting. I shifted gently, slipping out from beneath his arm. The blanket we had pulled over us fell to the side, and I tucked it back around him as he stirred slightly, murmuring my name in his sleep. My chest tightened at the sound, but I forced myself to move away. The kitchen was cool and quiet, the early morning sun streaming through the window above the sink. I busied myself with making coffee, the familiar motions grounding me as my thoughts raced. What had we done? My fingers trembled as I poured water into the coffee maker. I couldn't stop replaying the night before. The way he had looked at me, the way his hands had steadied me when I felt like I might break. For so long, I had felt invisible, like the world had moved on without me. But with Nathan, I swallowed hard, setting the pot down on the counter. This wasn't just about me, it was about him, about what this meant for both of us, about the lines we had crossed. The sound of footsteps behind me made my heart skip, and I turned to find Nathan standing in the doorway, his hair tousled, his shirt wrinkled. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, soft, searching, like he was trying to gauge where I stood. "Morning," he said quietly. "Morning," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped into the kitchen, leaning against the counter as he watched me. "You're up early." I couldn't sleep, I admitted, avoiding his gaze as I reached for a mug. Nathan didn't respond right away. Instead, he crossed the small distance between us, his hand brushing against mine as he took the mug from me. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. I hesitated, my throat tightening. "I don't know," I said finally. He nodded, setting the mug down on the counter. "Last night? It was a mistake," I said quickly, cutting him off. The words felt sharp and heavy, and I hated the way his expression faltered at them. "You don't mean that?" he said, his voice steady but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "I don't know what I mean," I said, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. I don't know how to do this, Nathan." You don't have to figure it all out right now, he said gently, stepping closer. But don't pretend it didn't mean something. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and the raw honesty in his eyes made my breath catch. It did, I admitted, my voice trembling. It did mean something, but that doesn't mean it's not complicated. I know it's complicated, he said, his tone firm, but I'm not scared of that. I need to know if you feel the same way. I closed my eyes, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I don't know how to answer that, I said softly. Yes, you do, he said, his voice quieter now. You're just scared to say it. He was right. I was terrified of what this meant, of what might happen if I let myself feel what I'd been trying so hard to deny. I don't want to hurt you, I whispered. You're not, he said, his hand brushing against mine. You won't. The warmth of his touch, the steadiness of his presence made something inside me crack. I looked at him, my eyes filling with tears, and for a moment I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way through this. Nathan, I said softly, my voice trembling. I don't know what happens next. Neither do I, he said, his thumb brushing against the back of my hand. But whatever it is, we'll figure it out. Together. His words settled over me like a promise, fragile but unyielding. I nodded, my chest tight with a mix of fear and hope. Later that morning, after Nathan had left to run errands, I sat by the window with my coffee, staring out at the garden. The storm from earlier in the week had left everything damp and vibrant, the flowers heavy with dew, and the grass lush and green. The house felt different now, quieter, but not in the way it had before. There was a weight to the silence, a sense of something shifting beneath the surface. I thought about Nathan, about the way he had looked at me this morning, the quiet conviction in his voice. He believed we could find a way through this, that what we felt was worth fighting for. And maybe he was right. For so long, I had buried my own needs, my own desires, telling myself they didn't matter. But last night had reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten, that I was still alive. That I could still feel. The future felt uncertain, the path ahead blurred and treacherous. But as I sat there, the morning sun warming my face, I felt a small, fragile spark of hope. Maybe, for the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. Maybe I was finally beginning to live. As the hours passed, I found myself thinking less about the risks and more about the possibilities, about what it might mean to let myself be happy again, even if it was complicated. When Nathan returned, his eyes found mine, and in that quiet, unspoken moment, I felt something shift. The story wasn't over.